frozen. Even Patrick's heavy breathing had locked up. Silence pressed uncomfortably at Bran's eardrums. He stared at the doorknob. It wasn't shiny, but he could see a dim spot of light reflected on its dull sheen, the flame of the candle. Shay's voice, barely more than an exhale. "Is someone at the door?" Maybe it was just the flickering of the candle, but Bran saw that little spot of reflected light distort, twisting and rippling. Heard the tiniest little creak of inner springs, then the barely audible click as the doorknob's mechanical guts hit the secured lock. Bran raised the pistol, saw the faintly glowing 3 dots of the front and rear sights roughly aligned, and superimposed them onto the door. "Who's out there?" he challenged, though his voice came out more hesitant than he would have liked. No response came from the other side. The twisted doorknob was released sharply, snicking back into its neutral position, causing Bran to twitch and almost crank a round off. He forced his finger to release its pressure on the trigger. He didn't want to send a bullet into one of the boys if they were fucking around on the other side. But wouldn't they have said something? "If there's someone on the other side of that door," Bran said again, louder and firmer this time, "you need to speak up." But again, no voice issued from the other side. Bran saw the triple dot of the sights bump and jump and knew his pulse was out of control. A muted, snuffling noise from the other side, like something had its nose pressed into the crack of the jamb and was scenting the air like a dog. Then one big inhale and a huff of an exhale. And then nothing. Bran blinked a drop of sweat out of his eyes. Should he just start shooting? But where would he aim? He only had 6 rounds in this stupid thing, and he couldn't afford to waste them. Every single one of those precious 9mm bullets needed to hit something vital, which meant he had to wait until he had a target to shoot for. Bran wished he'd spent a little more time with pistols, but he'd always preferred shotguns, because they didn't require as much accuracy, and Bran was no marksman. As though reading his mind, Patrick whispered from behind him, "Can you hit what you're aiming for with that thing?" Bran knew that he couldn't, not with any confidence, but what was the alternative? Hand the gun back to a stranger? Actually, maybe that wasn't such a bad idea. As of this particular moment, the 3 of them trapped in that room were all on the same side, the side of people that didn't want to get eaten. Bran kept his eyes on the door, but spoke over his shoulder at Patrick. "Can you—" It happened so fast that Bran didn't have time to think. The door reverberated with an ungodly crash. Wood cracked. The chair underneath the knob buckled but held. Bran yelped out a curse, straightening his 2-handed grip on the pistol. "Give me the fucking—" Patrick screamed, but was cut off by another massive blow to the door that snapped the heavy oak paneling straight down the middle, the flimsy chair falling apart like it was made of popsicle sticks. Wood came flying in at Bran's face, and he instinctively winced away from it, yanking the trigger as he did. The gun went off with a woefully inadequate pop as something huge and dark came hurtling through the doorway, scattering pieces of door and chair like shrapnel from a grenade. Bran didn't know if he'd hit anything with that first shot and tried to right his aim, but the massive shape was already closing with him in the blink of an eye, and all Bran saw was a mane of ropey dreadlocks flying, 2 eyes glimmering yellow in the candlelight, and a whole lot of big teeth. Something hit his hands right on the wrist, and the pistol went flying out of his grip. The same old stupid brawler's instinct hit Bran in the brain, whiting out any tactical thoughts, and he simply swung a clumsy right hook in the general direction of the thing's head. Barely got halfway through the punch before he felt the thing's tree-trunk arm slam simultaneously into the side of his head and his ribs. He went flying. Didn't even feel any pain. Was actually kind of mesmerized by the sensation of flight and how he didn't feel a goddamn thing as he struck the kitchen wall and bounced off. Thought left him. His head was full of angry bees. Everything in his vision an inscrutable jumble of shapes and colors, roaring in his ears. But beyond that, distantly, like hearing a horror movie played on a TV 2 rooms away, screaming, and snarling, and thrashing, and things breaking. Bran didn't have a cogent thought, but he had an instinctive fear for Shay. Knew he had to do something. Knew he had to help her. The pain hit him all at once, lancing through his ribs, his elbows, his neck, and his head. He was fumbling at the stone floor, flopping like a landed fish. Realized it, but couldn't do anything to stop it. His body was not his own at that moment. He'd been rocked. Didn't know how long it would last, but the panic was swelling rapidly to critical mass, exploding through him, urging his insensate limbs to move, to do something for fuck's sake. It wasn't that his vision had left him, really. It was like what his eyes were taking in could not be interpreted by his jangled brain. But that was the first thing to reestablish some control, his brain interpreting what his eyes were seeing. It still made no sense. Shay was backed into a corner of the kitchen, scrambling about and coming up with a butcher's knife. Patrick must have rolled off the counter because he was on the floor, crawling towards Bran. No, not crawling towards him, crawling towards the pistol that had been batted out of his hands. And on the other side of that kitchen island, there was simply a whirlwind of destruction. For the span of 2 high-octane heartbeats, Bran couldn't make sense of it. Was the beast that had come through the door? It had to be Khan, right? Just flailing about in the middle of the kitchen? The island blocked most of his view, but he could see limbs flying, shapes crashing into the walls, pulling down racks of pots and pans. It was like there were 2 Khans over there fighting each other. No, Bran realized as he managed to get his arms working again and thrust himself off the ground. That's Elijah in there. And not just 2 shapes spinning around and thrashing each other. There was a third. Cat! Bran dredged out, sounding drunk. Tottered on his hands and knees, the all-too-familiar sensation of unconsciousness threatening like a dark cloud. He couldn't make sense of the fight, but the next thing he knew, Cat was slammed onto the main island on her back. Khan's powerful arm extended thick, clawed fingers grasping for Cat's throat while she tried to squirm away, yowling and trying to push his one arm back with both of hers and still failing. Bran roared, or at least thought he did, though he couldn't hear himself over Khan's own ferocious bellows of rage. But whether or not he made a sound didn't matter. It pressed the looming unconsciousness out of his brain and he surged to his feet, throwing himself towards Cat and Khan. Right as he reached the island, something came hurtling out of the shadows in the back of the kitchen and rammed right into Khan, staggering him back and jolting him loose of Cat. It was Elijah, moving so fast you wouldn't have thought he'd been laid up for the past several days. But Elijah's primal instincts were at full throttle. His great, gaping maw slammed into Khan's arm at the same instant that one of Elijah's hands rocketed up and seized Khan by the throat, cutting off the Big Alpha's thunderous roar, just like Cat had taught them. Elijah was big, but Khan still outsized him, the difference between a thickly built man and his son, who was just as tall but not quite as filled out yet. Elijah's attack pushed Khan away from Cat, but that progress was short-lived. Khan went low, ducking his chin straight into Elijah's wrist, breaking his grip on Khan's throat, and then lunged. Elijah was still latched onto Khan's arm, and Khan seemed to use that to pull Elijah into his lunge, clamping his massive jaws right onto Elijah's skull. Elijah let out a cracking scream of pain and kicked out hard, catching Khan right in the gut. Bran reached out to grab Cat, feeling the need to protect her, to get her out of danger, but she juked around his clumsy hands, coming to all fours on the top of the island and launching herself at Khan. She caught him across the shoulders in a high tackle, peeling him off of Elijah's head, though Bran saw chunks of hair and scalp come away with him. Elijah reeled wildly as Khan careened backward with Cat attached to him, her claws raking his chest and sides, her teeth sinking into the back of his neck and thrashing as though she were trying to break it. Khan threw himself violently backwards, squashing Cat's body between his great bulk and the stone floor. Bran heard her snarls cut off in a wheeze of breath, but Khan was already rolling away from her shocked form. But the hybrids were no frail human beings. By the time Khan came up in a crouch, teeth bared and claws ready, positioned between the island and the shattered door, Elijah had leapt across the island to put himself in front of Shay, and Cat had scrambled to her feet, seething bloody froth out of her mouth. A bare moment of hesitation, the Alpha facing down his 2 hybrid attackers, and perhaps feeling a bit more respect for them. 2 gunshots rocked the room, strobing it into stark relief in a quick double flash. Bran didn't know where the bullets had hit Khan, but he saw the beast jerk. Bran had just enough time to snap his gaze to the right and see Patrick lying on his back, his knees propped up and the pistol held between them. Khan had barely righted himself from whatever shots had struck home before he spun lithely, showing no lack of speed for his apparent injury, and seemed to simply disappear. One more shot chased him out the door, snapping into the adobe wall and sending pieces of it in all directions, one stinging painfully against Bran's cheek, As though by some latent predator's instinct, both Elijah and Kat lurched towards the door as though to pursue the fleeing alpha. As big and as fierce as Khan apparently was, Bran had to admit, running in that particular instance was smart. Between Elijah and Kat and the gun in Patrick's hand, even an alpha as big and powerful as he was had to know he was in a bad spot. Was he going to bring his pack back with him? Bran jolted forward, holding a palm up to both of the hybrids, even as something tickled the back of his mind. "Kat! Elijah! Let him go!" What was bothering him so bad? He should have felt relief. Oh, yeah. The gun in Patrick's hand. As though Bran's sudden realization had been transmitted telepathically to the others, he, Kat, Elijah, and Shay all turned towards Patrick in unison, and found the man on his feet, favoring his busted knee and leaning his back against the wall. His face showed not one iota of relief. It was like Khan hadn't even left the room, because he was staring at the faces of the two hybrids in the candlelight, and it was just enough illumination to reveal what they truly were. Patrick raised the pistol and pointed it at Kat, then at Elijah, his eyes wide. What the fuck's going on here? Chapter 14. "All right, now hold on," Bran said, turning his attention from trying to keep Elijah and Kat from chasing after Khan to trying not to get shot by Patrick, or let him shoot one of the hybrids. "Don't you fucking point that gun at him!" Shay suddenly screamed, stepping around Elijah and putting herself in the path of the bullet. Elijah started to resist her, but Shay shoved him back so hard that he actually stumbled. With a gun trained on her child, hybrid or not, Shay had gone full mama bear. Unimpressed by this, Patrick's face contorted into confusion and anger. He didn't drop his sights, but simply pointed the weapon at Shay, as though he might shoot through her at Elijah. "What the fuck is going on here?" he raged. Are those... They're hybrids, okay?" Bran stammered out, trying to speak calmly, but also trying to let his voice pierce the rising ire sparking between Patrick and Shay. Patrick's eyes flashed to Bran. "The fuck's that supposed to mean?" Bran registered Kat moving behind him, probably trying to get into position to take the fight to Patrick. He waved a hand behind him, trying to silently tell her to stay put. "It means they're not full-blooded infected, Patrick. They're part human. And they're not..." He was about to say they weren't dangerous, but that wasn't exactly true. "They're not a threat to you, Patrick. They're just kids." He gestured behind him. "And this is Kat. She's only 3 years old. And she's friendly. She can talk, and she's fucking smart." His hand switched to pointing at Elijah. "And that one's Elijah. He's a good kid, but he's only 4 years old. He can talk too. And they were only trying to help." Shay took a step towards Patrick, her voice still sharp. "We'd all be dead if it weren't for them. Khan, or Big Black, or whatever you want to call him, he would have ripped us apart if they hadn't stopped him." Patrick was breathing heavily, pushing himself away from the wall like he couldn't decide whether to try to get an angle on the two hybrids or flee the room. But what was waiting for him if he fled? Despite all logic, Patrick seemed more frightened of the two hybrids in the room with him rather than the beast that had just gone outside. "They're..." Patrick croaked out, his eyes cycling between fear and anger now. "They're infected!" "No," Shay said, taking another step towards Patrick, her hands held up as though they might catch the bullet he was about to fire. "They're just mutated. It's all just a genetic mutation. They couldn't help it. It's not their fault." "It's not any of the infected's fault," Patrick snapped. "But we have to kill them anyways, or they'll kill us." "You're not listening to me!" Shay stamped her foot and shuffled still closer to Patrick. She was within arm's reach of the gun. Was she going to try to disarm him? Bran had never seen her show any hand-to-hand skills, but what else was her endgame here? "They're not infected! One of their parents was infected and the other was normal." "Actually," Bran put in, trying to help, "Kat's 3/4 human. Her father was full human and her mother was a hybrid, half infected and half human." "What?" Rather than be calmed by this, Patrick seemed all the more frustrated by his lack of comprehension. "Look," Shay said sternly, her hands trembling in the air just a foot or so from the muzzle of Patrick's pistol. which still had 3 rounds in it, Bran remembered. Enough to hurt and maybe kill a couple of them, but maybe they could charge him.
I get that you don't understand this, but it's the truth, and you need to listen to me. They are not gonna hurt you. You do not need to hurt them.
She cast a glance over her shoulder at Elijah.
They're our family.
Bran didn't know if Patrick simply couldn't handle what Shay had just said, or if it was simply the fact that her eyes had left him for a brief moment, but he moved forward, shockingly quick for a man with a busted knee. Before Bran could even think to move, Patrick had snatched Shay around the neck with one arm, spun her violently around so her back was to his chest, and then shoved the pistol to her temple. For the briefest of moments, Bran hoped that Shay would display that unforeseen aptitude in hand-to-hand he'd just been thinking about. Maybe stomp his insole or grab his balls or something. But she just froze, eyes stretching wide in shock. Patrick staggered backwards towards the door, grimacing as he forced his busted knee to work.
You all stay the fuck back!
He screeched, his harsh breath puffing at Shay's frizzy curls. Elijah and Kat both made a move towards Patrick and Shay, but Bran jumped to block them and waved them back, his eyes never leaving Patrick's.
Stop it, you two! Don't fucking move! I thought you said they weren't a threat to me!
Patrick spat.
Well, you're holding a gun to her head!
Bran shouted back.
The fuck did you think was gonna happen? You can't...
Patrick stumbled over his words, his eyes flicking between the 2 hybrids and totally bypassing Bran.
You can't live with these things!
As he moved backwards, Patrick seemed to glimpse his empty rifle leaning against the kitchen cabinet where Bran had set it. Almost as an afterthought, he flashed out the arm that had been holding Shay and hooked the rifle by the strap, taking it with him. Then, just as quick, got his hand back on Shay.
Patrick, you just don't understand,
Bran tried to soothe.
They're fucking infected!
Patrick screamed, still backing towards the shattered door.
Patrick, don't go out there with that alpha running around,
Bran urged. Patrick didn't seem to even hear him.
You can't live with infected! You can't trust them! They're not human! They'll fucking kill you the first time they're hungry and you don't feed them! They're fucking animals!
Patrick, Bran tried again. Khan's out there. Big Black. And you might have hit him once or twice, but do you really think 2 9mm to the body are gonna stop that motherfucker? Are you trying to feed yourself to him? You want to commit suicide, go right ahead, but let Shay go. And again, Bran's very reasonable concerns fell on deaf ears.
We can't fucking coexist with these things,
Patrick said, almost to the door now, his feet tumbling awkwardly over the wreckage.
They won't let us coexist with them. They'll just keep killing us until we're all fucking gone. Until all of humanity is fucking dead and they're the only ones left. Don't you see that?
Patrick's face scrunched up like he thought Bran and Shay were the ones that had gone mad.
There is no coexistence. It's only us or them.
Bran took a halting step towards Patrick and Shay, trying to talk and come up with some sort of plan in the same instant. But if he were being honest with himself, he was pretty piss-poor at both of those things.
You're wrong,
Bran said, shaking his head.
They're not animals. They can learn to control themselves. And these ones have. If you kill them, you're only killing people, Patrick. Not animals. People. And I don't think you're that type of guy, are you? You don't want to hurt people. You want to protect them. I get that. But these are people too. Not Big Black. Fuck him and fuck his pack and fuck the rest of the ones that try to eat us. But these two are not them.
Patrick suddenly cackled a mad laugh, sounding for all the world like he was at the end of his rope.
You people are insane! You're all fucking insane!
He paused partway into the frame of the door, the crazed mirth fading from his face as his eyes darted about over his shoulder.
Are there more of them here?
Bran didn't answer, and in the time it took him to decide whether or not to lie about it, he'd given Patrick all the answer he needed.
Holy fuck,
Patrick breathed, backing through the door.
This whole time? You've been breeding more infected this whole time, and we didn't even know you were out here. We're not breeding them,
Shay said, her voice strangled past the arm Patrick had wrapped around her throat. But Patrick seemed to have closed his ears to them. They'd become crazy people in his mind, and nothing they said could make any difference now.
I'm out here trying to get rid of these fuckers.
Patrick said, an almost aggrieved tone coming to his voice.
And you're breeding more of them right under my fucking nose.
Bran followed him at a distance as he moved through the door and out into the corridor beyond. God, what if one of the boys was outside right now? Would Patrick just shoot them if he saw them? And what the fuck was he planning to do with Shay?
Patrick, stop fucking around and think,
Bran hissed.
What's your plan here? You gonna hold Shay hostage for 20 fucking miles until you hike back to your settlement on a busted knee?
I've got, Patrick started to say, but then must have thought better of it.
You just stay right there. Don't follow me.
Bran halted, a single step outside of the door, while Patrick backed away down the corridor, moving towards the monastery's entrance.
You're gonna have to let her go. Not until I'm safe. You are safe, you fucking dumbass. Has anyone here hurt you? We took you in and tried to help you, and this is how you're gonna repay us? Don't follow me, Patrick said again. And don't send any of your fucking infected after me. I'll fucking kill them. With your 3 fucking bullets?
Bran shouted.
And what about Big Black and his pack? How you gonna handle them?
Patrick's inability to respond made it all too clear that he didn't have a plan at all. He was just scared out of his mind and winging it.
Patrick, you hurt her. There ain't no reason for me to let you live, Bran said. And there won't be shit I can say to those hybrids in there from chasing you down. Let her go. You want to take your chances out there and reject our help? You go ahead. We won't stop you. But you don't need to take her with you. Shut up. Just shut up. No more talking. Patrick,
The man rammed the pistol into Shay's temple so hard it pushed her head to one side.
No more talking!
So Bran shut his mouth. Because what the hell else was he going to do? Patrick had lost touch with reality. His fear and shock, and probably the pain in his leg, was robbing him of reason. If Bran said another word, he really did think the man would put a bullet through Shay's head. Patrick had backed almost entirely down their section of corridor, and now took the corner towards the monastery's entrance and the pitch darkness without, and the threats that it might still contain. Bran heard the light shuffle of feet behind him, barely audible over Patrick's own stumbling treads. He knew it was Kat and Elijah, but he didn't dare take his eyes off of Patrick and Shay, as though the force of his attention could keep those bullets inside that pistol.
Let us go,
Kat hissed from Bran's right side.
Don't,
Bran growled as Patrick and Shay disappeared towards the entrance.
He won't hold her the whole way. He can't.
Could he? From Bran's left side, Elijah issued a frustrated growl.
We can kill him. No, Bran snapped. What are you supposed to do when you see red?
Elijah made a noise somewhere between a scoff and a hiss of disapproval.
Fuck counting,
the hybrid seethed, surprising Bran. He turned to look at Elijah, whose eyes were just dark slits under his furrowed brow.
Need to kill him.
Bran's heart did a little stutter at the implications of that. Need to kill him? But then Elijah worked the rest of the words out of his clumsy mouth.
Before he brings others.
Shit. Elijah was right, wasn't he? Did Bran really think this guy was just going to leave them be after everything he'd learned? Patrick had made his position on the existence of this little hybrid orphanage abundantly clear. It's only us or them. Not a word of Bran and Shay's explanations had gotten through to him. His fear and anger towards the primals had deafened and blinded him. He only saw another nest of primals. He would come back, and when he did, he'd bring the proverbial angry villagers with him. Except they wouldn't have pitchforks, they'd have firearms, and they'd exterminate everyone in the monastery just to make themselves feel more secure, truth be damned. But if Shay made it out of this alive, would she finally see that violence was necessary? Or would she be aghast that Bran had let Kat and Elijah chase the man down and rip him apart? And what would she do if those 3 remaining bullets in Patrick's pistol found their way into Elijah's body? And what would Bran do if they found their way into Kat? It was the image of Shay's ashen, grieving face that made up Bran's mind. It was the image of her looking at him furiously, the relationship between them burning up like a little wooden bridge that would never be rebuilt. And then looking at him coldly as it all turned to ash.
No,
Brand said, starting forward but turning just enough to put both of his hands up, palms towards Kat and Elijah.
You two stay put. I'm serious. Don't fucking move from this spot.
They both flashed their teeth in response to this, but their feet remained where they were. Madness. This was madness. Patrick stumbled backwards into the dark woods, his ankles fumbling against the woman's as he slowly turned about, trying to scan the woods for Big Black and his pack, and also trying to get his bearings. His reality was melting into some nightmare dimension. He dimly recognized that he was perhaps out of his gourd. That was about the only real, rational thought that made it through his panic, the fact that nothing else sensible was making it through. Instead of logical thought, there were only images, hanging from a thread of terror and an overwhelming sense of unfairness. His entire team was dead. He knew this, and yet he could not help a sense of disbelief. Perhaps because, in the darkness, he had not actually seen them die. The images in his mind were only of shadows, of desperate, fearful faces, blanched by the few spears of bright weapon lights that they'd turned on when it became obvious that everything had gone tits up and there was no point in trying to be stealthy anymore. And the screaming, the cries for help, the desperate keening of humans turned into prey animals, pleading with Patrick to help them. And then only gurgling and rasping and death rattles, all a part of a macabre orchestra accompanied by animal snarls and rending flesh and the sound of rushing wind and thrashing brush and his own pounding heart as he'd fled. He'd fled. Fucking coward. Shame curdling into rage. Rage that sought an outlet like an overpressurized pipe. And the only outlets he had at hand were either himself for his cowardice or the mad woman he was dragging along with him. "You stupid bitch," Patrick hissed in her ear, aware, albeit peripherally, that there was no real purpose to whispering, as his lame-legged flight through the woods was loud enough to announce his presence to every infected within a mile radius of him. "What the fuck were you thinking?" It seemed that the woman's fear had somehow transmogrified. It was no longer for him, even though he was the one that was pointing a gun at her head. Her face twisted around, and despite the darkness, Patrick could tell she was trying to search the woods for a threat. "We shouldn't be out here," she said, her voice hitching. "He's out here. We should have stayed inside." "Shut up. You're gonna get us both killed, you ignorant fuck." He didn't even think about it. Violence took a hold of him, almost a flinch response. He reared his gun hand back and pistol-whipped the woman across the side of the head, hard enough that, as she tumbled out of his hands, he had a meek moment of regret, knowing that he'd struck her hard enough to do real damage. He hadn't meant to. "Shit! Fuck!" He swayed as the woman collapsed into the leaves at his feet, groaning and twitching. "Get up! Get the fuck up!" he ordered her, pointing the pistol vainly at her head. Then he remembered where he was and what was out there with him. He raised the pistol and swung it in a wide, blind arc, but there was nothing to see but gradations of black and impressions of trees. He knew damn well he was a sitting duck out here. Big Black could creep up on him, not making a sound in the damp leaves. It would only take one pounce, one lunge, and Patrick would be dead. Eventually, after experiencing the horror of being torn apart, what his team had experienced. "Oh, God," Patrick groaned, backpedaling away from the unconscious woman until her form melted into the darkness. He couldn't wait for her to wake up, if she was even going to wake up at all. And something about that stung him with guilt. He'd knocked the woman unconscious, maybe even given her some serious brain damage, and then left her to die in a nighttime forest with an apex predator on the loose. He hadn't meant to do that. But now it was done and could not be undone. He couldn't stay here. He'd called for backup the second they'd been hit by Big Black, but hadn't had a chance to give a location before he'd lost his radio. He knew the security force from Winchuck would come to Patrick's last known location, Ambush Alley. After a lifetime in the woods, Patrick had developed an almost preternatural sense of direction. Despite getting himself turned around in the woods, he knew what direction to head to reach the road between Winchuck and O'Brien. Knew it without having to think about it. He turned and ran as fast as his busted knee would allow. "You're in danger," This thought, more of a feeling really, looped in Shay's brain even while she was still barely conscious on the ground. Everything was wild and surreal. She was half in and half out of this world, her mind overlaying disturbing and nonsensical dreams over the input from her rattled senses. The soggy leaves of the forest floor became a pit of viscera into which she was sinking. The black impressions of tree trunks became clawed limbs that held her down against her will, so that all of her thrashing attempts to get up and get running amounted to nothing. The pain in the side of her head became Khan's jaws, clamped around her skull, just like he'd done to Elijah. Animal instinct for survival reasserted itself long before full consciousness came back to her, so that by the time she actually had a clear thought, she realized she was already on her feet, stumbling through the woods with her hands groping in front of her. How had that happened? She rocked to a stop, hearing her own breath rattling and wheezing in her throat. Her head lashed from side to side, bringing pain like fire pokers jabbing at her skull. She was trying to see where the hell she was, but there was no making sense of these lightless woods. Almost by reflex, her hand came up to the right side of her face. Cold, wet fingers touched warm, wet flesh. It stung sharply, and she jerked her hand back, getting only the barest impression of a nasty gash in her scalp near her right temple, the area around it swollen and tender. The urge to run was almost irresistible, but she managed to keep her feet still because she knew she was lost in these woods. She had no clear sense of where she was. Couldn't even recall what general direction she'd been dragged in after leaving the main entrance of the monastery. Continuing to run was more likely to put her further from safety. So she stood there, aching and trembling, eyes darting and seeing nothing, ears ringing but perceiving no sound but the slow tap of dripping leaves. She couldn't stay out here all night. But with no sense of where to go to find safety, she found herself paralyzed with indecision, that juvenile instinct to just freeze when there seemed no way out. Perhaps she could just lie down, cover herself with leaves. Maybe the rain would keep her scent down, and if she didn't make too much noise, Khan might not find her. That was the level of her desperation, to willfully believe in fantasies. She shuffled forward until her hands struck the wet bark of a large tree. Then she turned her back on it and slid down until she was curled into a ball at its base, now too fearful to even dare to rustle the leaves to cover her. But she heard another rustling. There was something distinct about the sound of the human tread. There's no mistaking it for an animal. Even Shay, though she was the furthest thing from an outdoorsy type, knew that. But then she thought, is that how primals sound too? If they're walking on two legs? Her breath froze in her chest, trying to become so inanimate that not the slightest sound wave would be issued from her vicinity. The rustling leaves stopped for a few heartbeats, then continued, getting closer, then stopping again. Was it her imagination, or did she hear the sound of snuffling, just like the sound of Khan sniffing at them through the kitchen door? "Shay!" A bare whisper hissed out into the night. Shay's head exploded with a mix of adrenaline and relief, making her gasp. The footfalls stuttered closer. "Shay, it's Bran!" She hesitated, wanting desperately to cry out to him, but fear that it might be some trick stoppered up her mouth. It was ridiculous. Khan couldn't speak. She knew this, and he certainly couldn't imitate Bran's voice, which she clearly recognized, but fear can make a fool of anyone. It wasn't until she heard the voice issue a frustrated, "God damn it," that she knew it was really Bran. "Bran!" she whispered into the darkness, turning towards the sound of the footfalls and clawing her way up the tree until she was upright. "I'm here!" Even as sure as she was, it still terrified her to hear those footsteps come rushing towards her, to see the dim shape emerge out of the gloom, and she thought for just a hair's breadth of time that the figure looked far too large to be Bran. She almost turned and bolted, but his hands took her by the shoulders, firm but not aggressive, and she slumped into him, and then immediately began pushing him into motion again, her voice croaking, "Get me the fuck out of these woods!" Kat and Elijah stayed right where Bran told them to stay, until he was out of sight, that is. Kat loved the man like a friend and a father combined, but sometimes he was stupid. Sometimes human beings in general were stupid. Actually, they were like that a lot. For all of her struggle with speaking their language, Kat was a smart girl, and her peculiar combination of human and primal genetics gave her a unique perspective on both races of beings. It reminded her of the contraption she'd occasionally used when she lived on that ranch in the valley, the one they used for carrying 2 large buckets of water at a time. 2 buckets affixed to 2 ends of a wooden beam. 2 weights at opposite ends, and in order to carry them effectively, you had to position yourself right in the middle of that wooden beam. You had to balance them. Humans and primals? They were like those 2 heavy buckets filled with water. On the one side were the humans, with all their emotions and feelings and impractical ideas that made them both foolish and beautiful. And on the opposite end there were the primals, who were very intelligent, but possessed of no inclination towards any emotions more complex than fear, anger, and sometimes a dim sadness, though it never moved them to compassion. They always did what was most pragmatic. And Kat stood in the middle of those 2 extremes, balancing her human emotions and ideals with her primal instinct for supreme pragmatism. So when Bran disappeared through the monastery's entrance, she immediately spun and looked at Elijah. Her eyes were much better in the dark than a regular human's, so she could clearly see the look on Elijah's face and knew that he was wrestling with the very same balancing act.
"Get your brothers,"
Kat said. Elijah looked at her, his brow furrowing even more.
"Why?" "To teach them,"
Kat said.
"To fight."
Elijah seemed troubled by this and glanced out where Bran had disappeared.
"What about Shay?"
Kat didn't see what that had to do with anything. Regardless of what happened with Shay, they were all still in danger, and they all needed to unlock the violent potential that was inside of them if they wanted to survive what came for them, whether it be Khan or the man that had hunted him. But the human part of her recognized the need not to brush Elijah's worries away. Elijah had a deep relationship with Shay, just as Kat had with Bran. It took her a moment to put herself in Elijah's shoes. It was an exercise in empathy that was still rather difficult for her, but she got there.
"Bran will find her."
Then she did another thing that was somewhat foreign to her. She reached out and touched Elijah. She knew that touch was important to humans, and to some extent even to primals. But she hadn't been the recipient of much positive physical contact during her short life, so it was still awkward to her. Elijah stiffened when she touched his arm, but then relaxed. Strange how touch could do that. It didn't make any sense to Kat, but she knew that it was a real thing. She'd felt it herself a few times when Bran had touched her to comfort her or relax her.
"Get your brothers,"
Kat repeated.
"We will train." "Shay won't like it. She doesn't need to know."
Elijah grunted uncertainly but started to turn away. Kat stayed him by tightening her grip on his arm. He looked back at her curiously. This was going to be a lot of words. Kat girded herself up to get them all out. If she could just learn to speak at the pace of her thoughts, she might not have so much trouble holding on to what she wanted to say.
"Tell them,"
she began, slow but steady,
"to wait until Shay is back in her room. Then meet me." "Where?"
Kat looked in the direction of a large room she knew of, but didn't know that it was called a sanctuary, only that it was large and had a bunch of benches that could easily be moved to give them an open area. She pointed to it.
"That place."
He looked, then nodded, understanding. When he left to deliver the message to his brothers, Kat stalked down the corridor on light, quiet feet until she reached the main entrance. With her night-adapted eyes, the woods beyond stood visible, though washed of color. In the dark, her eyes only seemed to be able to perceive gradations of gray, blue, and yellow, but it was enough to see most of what lay out there. To the right of the overgrown gravel road that led to the monastery, she could see where a path had been trampled through the sodden grasses, the sparkle of delicate raindrops clinging to the blades wiped clean from passing feet. And she could hear rustling. Too loud to be primals. It was 2 pairs of human feet walking together. For a moment, she wondered if it was the man with the pistol. She couldn't remember what he'd called himself, still dragging Shay away from them. But no, these footfalls were drawing nearer. She scented the air and was surprised to find herself relieved at the familiar sense of Bran and Shay wafting out of the woods on a light headwind. Surprised not because she was relieved that Bran was okay, of course she was relieved for that, but because she was also relieved that he had found Shay. Strange. Maybe she'd grown fonder of Shay than she'd realized. She stayed silent, panning her gaze around the woods and continuing to scent the air and listen carefully for anything that was not Bran and Shay. But the woods without were still and empty of the distinct odor of primals. That was something that the humans were better at than the primals, staying relatively clean and keeping their scent relatively inoffensive. After only a few moments, Cat watched them emerge from the woodline. Bran helping a dazed-looking Shay along, her arm slung over his shoulder for support. The scent of fresh blood hit Cat suddenly. In other times, that scent had sparked off something dark inside of her, but now it only worried her. Was it Bran that was bleeding? Or Shay? She found that both possibilities concerned her. She jogged out to meet them. When they heard her coming, they halted, their eyes going wide, trying to see through the darkness, and Cat remembered that their eyesight was shit. They couldn't tell who was coming up on them. "It's Cat," she whispered roughly, then continued her approach when they relaxed a bit. Up close, Cat could see that it was Shay that was bleeding. She had a nasty head wound to the right side of her scalp, just above her ear. Blood was streaming down the side of her face and neck and staining the old shirt she wore. "Help me get her inside," Bran grunted. Yes, Cat thought, helping them along. Get her inside. Put her to bed. Then she could train the others. Chapter 15.
Shay says violence is bad.
This from a worried-faced Shad, to which Mish and Abed both nodded. Not to be left out, Jacob nodded as well, a bit more emphatically to make up for the fact that he'd been late in agreeing with them. Kat's nose wrinkled in distaste as she looked at them, and most of that distaste was because she knew that she would have to convince them to do this, especially after they'd all gotten in trouble with Shay for it before, and that meant that she was going to have to do a lot of talking. They all stood clustered together in the darkness of the sanctuary's center aisle, not yet having moved the benches. She didn't know to call them pews, because they hadn't yet decided if they were going to go through with this. It wasn't far from dawn now, Cat knew. Maybe another 2 hours, because it had taken a long time for Bran to stitch up Shay's head wound, and he'd requested Cat's help, though she hadn't done much but hold a candle so he could see what he was doing. After he'd finally stopped the bleeding and got the scalp wound stitched, made harder by having to work around Shay's thick hair, he'd asked her if she had a concussion, whatever the hell that was. Shay had confirmed that she did have one, but it must not have been such a bad thing because Cat didn't think she seemed overly concerned with it. Bran was concerned, but he was a worrier, so Cat hadn't put much stock in that. After a brief but solemn conversation running through all that had happened, Bran had soothed Shay with a bunch of promises he couldn't possibly keep. Stuff like, "You're safe now, and we'll keep watch, and I'll make sure nothing bad happens." Idiotic to make those types of promises, but Cat held her silence. Eventually, Shay had drifted off to sleep, and unsurprisingly, Bran was too wired to go back to bed, so he offered to take watch, and that was just fine by Cat. She had things to do. Bran could make all the stupid promises he wanted, but Cat would actually do what was necessary to give them a chance. So now she stood in the sanctuary, carefully lining up her words while Elijah and his brothers looked on. Here was one good thing about hybrids and their speech. It took so long to say anything at all that they didn't have time for bullshit. Regular humans would say so many words that they inevitably tied themselves in knots with a bunch of stuff that wasn't true, in an attempt to make either themselves or a third party feel a certain way, regardless of whether that way of feeling was correct. Kind of like how Bran had promised Shay everything would be okay.
"Violence,"
Cat began.
"not always bad. Bad if you do bad things. Good if you do good things."
Now Shad, Mish, and Abed were shaking their heads. Jacob watched them for a moment, then decided to shake his head as well. Elijah gave no response at all.
Always bad,
Shad responded.
You hunt?
Cat said, part question and part assertion. Shad nodded.
Yes. You kill? Yes. That is violence.
Shad frowned as though he'd never considered that before.
Violence, so the pack eats. That is good, right?
Highly confused by this shift in perspective, Shad looked to Elijah, but the eldest of them still said nothing. Cat pointed to Elijah and then to herself.
Me? Elijah? We fight Khan. Keep him from killing Shay. That is violence. To save someone. That is good, right?
This garnered a few hesitant nods, though Jacob seemed too taken aback to agree.
You can be violent,
Cat said, pointing to them now.
You can be very good at violence. That is not bad. You decide what to do with that violence. You decide to be good or to be bad. You can help protect this place. Protect Shay and each other. And that is good.
A long silence followed this, all the male hybrids of the monastery exchanging uncertain looks. But Cat noticed, as the moments stretched, that those looks were becoming less uncertain and more open to what she was offering. It was Jacob's small, halting voice that broke the moment.
How?
Satisfaction, like a warm blanket being draped over Cat's shoulders. And very strangely, she had the urge to stretch the corners of her mouth. To smile? Weird. Must have been the human side of her. Cat looked at each of them in turn as she spoke her next words.
You fight like you hunt. You treat the one you're fighting like prey.
The next morning felt to Bran like some sort of waking dream. He knew this feeling, knew it was because he hadn't slept the previous night, or at least that was contributing to the weird, dissociated feeling. Also contributing was all the surreal shit that happened last night. Dawn blazed on into morning, with a dramatic skyscape visible over the trees. Large, dark clouds scudded rapidly towards the rising sun, while thin wisps caught the rays and turned to gold. Everything was still soaking wet from the rain the night before. Bran's pants were sodden up to the knees from traipsing endlessly around the perimeter of the monastery. In the morning light, the horrors of the night before seemed like they might be easily forgotten nightmares. Bran was alarmed to find himself relaxing into that fantasy, but he kept reminding himself that it had happened. Khan had been here. The hunter named Patrick had been here. Guiltily, Bran found himself hoping that Khan or his pack of primals had found that man in the woods the previous night and torn him apart before he'd reached safety. It wasn't that Bran really wanted the guy dead. Yeah, there was a part of him that was mighty pissed about how things had gone down. And maybe it was just the sleep deprivation dulling his emotions. He was too tired to really feel mad. But Bran found he couldn't really blame the guy for doing what he did. If Bran hadn't known the things he'd known, if he hadn't known Cat, or the fact that hybrids weren't always animalistic and crazy, he could see himself doing exactly what Patrick had done. But he did still hope the guy was dead, because there was no doubt in Bran's mind that Patrick was going to return, and when he did, he'd come with a whole lot of backup this time, and he'd come for one thing, to exterminate the hybrids. Bran kept coming back to a singular moment in the darkness and terror of the previous night, the moment Patrick had pointed the pistol at them, despite Shay and Bran's desperate attempts to reason with him. Bran remembered the look on that man's face when all their words had fallen short. There were a lot of different emotions contained in that look. but it was the unique convergence of them that stuck with Bran, and the knowledge that it imparted. Namely, the fact that, in that moment, Bran knew that Patrick had categorized them as enemies, and he distinctly felt that Patrick was the type of person to pursue his enemies with single-minded determination, and he wouldn't stop until he'd killed them or been killed himself. And of course, Patrick wasn't the only thing Bran had to worry about. Khan was still out there, and he'd given them a message just as clear and undeniable as the understanding Bran had garnered from that look on Patrick's face. Khan still considered the monastery his, and he fully intended to take it back. So Bran hadn't slept a wink. All night long, his brain had run amok trying to figure a way out of this, trying to see the monastery as a defensible position. But it wasn't made to be a fortress, and frankly, it sucked for that task. He tried to think about how he might retrofit some of those gardening tools, maybe grind some points down into spears or something. A spear was better than nothing, right? But who would he arm with them? If he tried to arm Shay or any of her boys, she'd lose her mind, wouldn't she? Or had the events of the previous night maybe shaken her loose from her hardline stance against violence? As the sun came up and began its slow arc across the sky, heating everything up and promising Bran that it was going to be a hot, muggy day, he'd increasingly circled one idea as the only reasonable option for them: getting the hell out of there. Maybe Shay wouldn't go for arming herself and her boys with makeshift spears, but surely she could see the wisdom in fleeing. She'd built a nice life in the monastery, but sometimes, especially nowadays, you had to be willing to cut ties and run if that's what survival called for. The morning drew on. The boys appeared, going about their daily chores. Elijah was with Kat, patrolling the ground that Bran had walked over countless times the night before. Elijah was not well. It didn't take a doctor to see that. He moved slow and exhausted, often holding his arm to his wound. His expression seemed a near constant wince. Kat kept looking at him as they walked, perhaps expecting him to keel over at any second. Since Kat and Elijah had decided to take up perimeter watch, Bran retreated to the courtyard and the stone bench within, where he could keep an eye on Shay's room. He wrestled with whether or not to try to ease her gently into the concept of running away, or just spring it on her the second she appeared. Easing sounded nicer, but maybe if he tried to ease her into it, she wouldn't take it very seriously. Maybe if he pounced on her as soon as she woke up, she'd feel the urgency. Or perhaps she'd just get pissed. No one liked to be badgered the moment they woke up. But this was survival they were talking about, not some bullshit housekeeping. As morning crept towards midday, Shay did not appear. He began to worry, as was his proclivity. He'd admonished her not to sleep if she thought she had a concussion. She'd told him that was a myth. He'd trusted her because, while being a midwife didn't make her a medical expert, it sure made her more of an expert than Bran was. Now he was wondering if that had been wise. Maybe you shouldn't take the medical advice of a person who's just had their skull rocked. As the sun crept over the top of the monastery's roofline and bathed Bran in sauna-like heat, he started to think about going to Shay's door and checking on her. Seemed like maybe that would be the prudent thing to do. He was thinking this with his eyes closed, because he just needed to rest them a bit. The sun was so bright, and his eyes felt dry and scratchy and desperately in need of a break. Yes, she couldn't fault him for being concerned for her. She wouldn't be that pissed if he just knocked on her door to check on her. And then, once she was fully awake, he could explain to her that they needed to beat feet. He felt better now that he had a plan of action. It actually kind of relaxed him. And then he fell asleep. Kat and Elijah worked their way through the edges of the woods, all around the large clearing in which the monastery sat. Though Elijah hadn't said as much, it was clear to Kat that Khan and his primals usually roamed the woods to the east of the monastery. When they were on that side of the woods, Elijah became increasingly tense and did a lot more scenting of the air and ground. Unfortunately, the wind was not helpful. It was blowing west to east, so they were upwind of the direction where Khan would most likely come from. It wasn't a strong wind, but Kat could tell it was strong enough that if Khan and his primals came for them, they'd be able to get very close to the monastery before Kat smelled them. The only good thing about the wind was that it was seeding the forest to the east with Elijah's scent, which seemed to be what had kept Khan at bay in the past. And that made sense to Kat. Though Khan was physically more imposing, Elijah was still almost as big. And a smart alpha doesn't go around challenging every male it encounters, especially ones that had a good chance of inflicting some serious injuries on it in a fight. Did Khan know that Elijah was wounded? He'd fought well the previous night, Kat thought, but she could smell the faint scent of his wound. Kind of like the scent of blood, but milder and more tangy. And Elijah's sweat smelled off. Any primal that smelled the perspiration coming off of him would know that he was unwell. Kat had to assume that Khan had smelled that when they'd fought, which meant even if Khan was a smart, cautious alpha, as it seemed he was, if he knew that Elijah was not in top shape, he might decide to come for them, regardless of Elijah's scent being spread through the woods by the wind. Completing their fourth patrol of the wood line in the last 2 hours, Kat paused and regarded Elijah with a careful inspection. He looked terrible. Like dog shit, as Bran would have said. His deeply brown skin had turned a lifeless gray around his eyes and mouth. Shirtless, his body glimmered with sweat, but Kat noticed that it wasn't pouring like it had been earlier, which wasn't a good sign. It meant Elijah was getting dehydrated. Already, his temples and forehead looked ashy with salt deposits. His posture was stooped a bit, like he didn't have the strength to stand fully erect. And he was flagging, slowing down. Kat kept having to pause and wait for him to catch up.
"You need rest,"
Kat said when he'd slumped his way up to her. Elijah didn't immediately respond, just stood there, breathing heavier than he should have been, blinking blearily into the humid forests, often stretching his eyes wide after he blinked, as though he were having trouble focusing.
"Guard,"
Elijah said.
"Patrol."
Kat shook her head.
"Let Bran."
She gently took Elijah by the arm and pulled him towards the monastery's entrance.
"Come on. You rest."
Elijah must have been close to falling out because he didn't resist at all or even try a token argument. Just huffed and let her tow him out of the woods into the scalding sunshine and back towards the monastery. Once in the courtyard garden, she spotted Bran, who looked half melted into the stone bench. His mouth hung open, snoring softly. His clothes were almost entirely sweated through. Old man, Kat thought, not without affection. She and Elijah made their way up to him. He had that stupid pitchfork still in his hands. His grip was loose, but it was there, and Kat had no desire to get stabbed with it, so she kept some distance between them, then gingerly kicked his boot and fainted back. He came awake with a snort, his eyes all bloodshot and confused. "What?" he immediately said. The word came out sharp and distinct, but his eyes told Kat that he still wasn't quite there yet. She eyed the pitchfork as his grip worked on it. His gaze went back and forth between Kat and Elijah, and she waited until some measure of recognition came to him. When it did, Bran got irritated. "What, Kat? Don't just stand there and stare at me all creepy-like." There was the Bran she knew. Confident that he was fully awake now, Kat nodded at Elijah.
"He needs rest. You take watch."
Bran groaned irritably, but hoisted himself to his feet. "Yeah, fine." He frowned around the courtyard. "You seen Shay yet?" Kat shrugged.
"Still asleep."
Bran grunted, stretching a tweak out of his back with a grimace. "All right, you take care of Elijah. I'm gonna check on Shay, and then I'll get out there." They started to separate, but Bran stopped them with a, "Hey." Kat raised her eyebrows in question. Bran pointed at her. "He needs rest. No funny business." As naive as she sometimes was, Kat felt she knew what Bran was getting at. She shook her head and, without even a bit of shame, said,
"No running. I know."
Bran made a face but said nothing else. Kat waited until he turned into the corridor towards Shay's room. She'd been acting like she was taking Elijah back to his room, but once Bran wasn't paying attention, she course-corrected. They headed for the sanctuary, where Kat could smell that the others had gone after completing their chores. Elijah needed rest, but he could at least watch them train. It was the unique folly of youth to believe that their elders are cozened by their attempts to be tricky. As the saying goes, youth and strength will never beat age and treachery. Bran gave Kat a moment to commit because he knew damn well she wasn't taking Elijah to his room. He'd seen her target glance the sanctuary no less than 3 times as they'd been talking. Clearly, that's where she intended to go, and that made Bran awful curious because he'd noticed the other boys going in there earlier, too. Of course, this was their home, and he wasn't the hall monitor, so he hadn't really thought much of it. Now he did. Pausing at Shay's door, Bran decided to let her sleep for a bit longer and turned to see Kat and Elijah slink their way into the sanctuary. When he heard the muted sound of the door closing again, Bran headed over, intending to catch them in whatever they were doing. God, he hoped he wasn't about to walk in on some adolescent hybrid orgy. He was less than 10 feet from the sanctuary door when a sound from within made him halt. A big bang like a body hitting the floor. Then the sound of scrabbling claws on hard floors. Grunting and growling. No, not an orgy. Kat was running a little fight club. Shit, Bran said, slinking up to the door. Should he interrupt them? So Kat was trying to teach them to fight. Yeah, that went against what Shay had told them, but their asses were hanging in the wind here. Surely even Shay could forgive...
No!
That was Kat's voice, sharp and stern. Bran's ears pricked up, and he inclined his head towards the door.
Too careful,
Kat continued, clearly correcting someone.
You are thinking too much. Don't think. Just do. Let the violence out. You have it in you. Just let it out. Get mean. Move fast. Go for the throat. Go dark mode.
Bran wasn't entirely sure whether the blood